Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. I was just getting into some of the tracks because I just wanted to familiarize myself with it because this is a fun record, man.
It's a very interesting record.
How are things going with you and the job, man?
Not bad, not bad. I got to go in at 12:45 today, so
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, things have been going pretty interesting for my job. Something fun happened to me yesterday.
oh jeez.
Yeah, I ended up washing my hands after taking out the trash, and then I looked up at the mirror, and you know what I realized?
What?
That I had a broken face.
Again?
Again, you know it, man. Yeah, and that's the intro. Welcome back, everyone, to the best music podcast on this side of the Mississippi, hosted by two dashingly good-looking men who share the same middle name. I am the one, the only, the undisputed Ryan James Kearns.
And I am the one, the only, the 2 weeks in a row blindsided Matthew James Durzik.
And this podcast is called Hey, Listen to This. And if this is the very first time that you are listening to me and Matt talk about music, first of all, on behalf of me and Mr. Blindside here, I want to welcome you to the show. And essentially what we do here is that we take turns picking albums that we're going to dissect track by track. We can go as thorough as we want, or we can go as short as we want. We could be like, this is a nothing burger, or we can spend 20 minutes on the opening verse of Wilco's Hotel Fox. I'm trying to break your heart. I can't remember the actual album title off the top of my head. I need another cup of coffee this morning. I spent all my mental energy working on that Blindside for Matt here. So last week we covered a band called Jellyfish. And overall, just putting a capstone on that review, speaking as somebody that never experienced what a jellyfish was in a musical sense. Well, actually, to be honest with you, I don't even think I've even, seen one in the wild before. But nonetheless, I was really impressed with what that record had to offer. And I was extremely happy that you suggested it, dude.
Thank you. And we move from the pop of Jellyfish to this week, the almost exact opposite of that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that whenever we were doing the Jellyfish review, because when we did the Taylor Swift review, I said I needed a palate cleanser, and so I went into my neck of the woods with Spanish love songs, and then you declared that you kind of needed a palate cleanser after going through that dark, depressive album. So that's why you had us do Jellyfish's Spilt Milk. So I joked at the end of that review that we actually just released today now that our palates are both cleansed, we're ready for what's ever on the table.
And what is on the table today is an album that Ryan chose called Surfer Rosa by the Pixies. And Ryan, I will defer to you as to why you chose this album this week.
The main reason why I chose this album is that with the news of Steve Albini's passing, I wanted to dive into one of his more iconic works. And with the Pixies as a whole, I only really listened to, I can remember correctly, the album Doolittle, and I remember, walking away from that album, hey, the Pixies, they had some really good energy, some fun tunes. Of course, most music fans know about one of the most famous needle drops in cinematic history, that featured the Pixies in the movie Fight Club, with the song "Where Is My Mind," which is featured on the album that we're covering today. And yeah, I knew that when we did "In Utero" by Nirvana, I really dug the production elements that Steve Albini brought to the table. One of my favorite bands that a lot of people don't know of, Cloud Nothings, I got introduced to them with their album Attack on Memory, which was produced by Steve Albini. And even reflecting upon that today, you can really notice a difference in the production when Steve Albini worked on their stuff. I'm talking about Cloud Nothings, as compared to when he's not on the table, because it's not as vicious, ferocious, and the other albums that Cloud Nothing has put out without Steve Albini. They don't really capture the sound of the band as a whole.
Yeah, and again, this is not the first Albini album that we have talked about. We have talked about In Utero before. And this album very much does sort of, touch on the theme of, the rawness of a band and the raw sound and a very raw atmosphere that is created. So, with that being said, you don't just want to jump right into it?
Absolutely, man. One thing that I want to keep in mind throughout this whole review is that one thing that Steve Albini was known for is that he wanted to place the listener as close to the band as possible, in that he wanted to capture their sound organically. So if you were to be in the room with the band while they were playing, this is what he was aiming for. So when I heard about that production focus that he had, it really helped me understand this album as a whole a little bit better. Because I'm just gonna come out right out of the gate and say this: when I did my first initial listen of this album, I was just oh, this is rough, man.
Right.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Kicking things off with the very first song, Bone Machine. And so right away we get a very interesting song, playing with thundering drums, and excellent crunchy guitars that lead everything off. And even before that, we get an intro saying, "This is a song for Carol." And the verses here, at least in the first one, it's talking about how there's this couple, and the one knows that the other's cheating on them, but hey, they're going to the one who is cheating in the relationship is going to the beach all day, if we all know what that means. And I don't know, I really like this song. It's really interesting what happens in the chorus here, where the band drops out to bare instrumentation, and then you get Frank Black and Kim Deal singing, "Your bones got a little machine," and then you get that vocal response there. Overall, though, I thought this was a very solid track to open everything up, and even at the very end, where Frank and Cam are just trading off, and that kind of vicious kind of tone. I'm all here for it right out of the gate.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is a solid opener. And like you mentioned before we started talking about it, it does very much feel very raw. You mentioned the drums and the guitars being right up front. Frank Black's vocals are way in the back, except for the hook where he and Kim Deal are singing together. And you mentioned the lyrics, which I thought were very biting. And it really only leaves me with one question, which is, who is Carol? because my goodness, this song is quite bitter and passive aggressive in that nature. And even for the vocals being as far back as they are, they're not so far back that you can't fully comprehend what's going on. And furthermore, as we'll get into later on the album, the production choices that were made here, at least for most of these tracks, do create a certain vibe, a certain consistent vibe throughout the album.
So, talking about like production choices, how much did you look into when it came to all the different kind of tricks that Steve brought to the table in the production aspect?
I dived into it a little bit, not like super deep, but I did look up a couple of clips and a couple of articles where he tried certain things to that he hadn't tried before. And as far as the actual placement of the drums and everything, I didn't read anything too far into that. But again, it sounds how it sounds, and there's a certain vibe I got from that.
Yeah. So, there's certain things when it comes to the vocals, when we get to the specific tracks that I'm going to mention, that just work out so well. But with here, what I want to highlight is to get that drum sound, that thudding drum sound that you hear throughout basically throughout the whole album. If I'm not mistaken, which I don't believe I am, he actually had the drums recorded in the hallway. So, yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and thinking outside of the box, because from what I understand, he didn't really like the sound of the studio room so much, so he took the band out of the studio whenever he saw fit. Moving on from that, one criticism that I do have of this opening track here, which is gonna come up a couple different times throughout this whole album, is that the verses are kind of disjointed and disconnected. And I know this is the Pixies' first album, so maybe their songwriting wasn't as strong and they were just trying to throw stuff against the wall. But in the second verse, instead of elaborating on themes of oh, hey, this lover's cheating on me and this is what she's doing, he kind of Frank goes off about talking about before I even utter another word, there's a lot of explicit themes in this album that I'm gonna try to be as polished as I can be, but there's no, sometimes it's hard to polish something as dark as this. So for what I'm trying to get at, in verse 2, he's talking about being molested by a preacher, which in by itself is the verse is written well, but it doesn't really connect with everything else. Maybe he's just trying to give backstory to the subject material of the songs, point of view, what his experience is. But that's just me reading into it. Yeah. And then one other thing I'm going to mention, and we can move on to the next track, unless you have anything else to add on to Bone Machine, is the line about your Irish skin looks Mexican. Kind of plays off the fact that oh, hey, you're spending all day at the beach, and you're spending all day with this person that you're cheating with me on. And the very next line is, our love is rice and beans and horse lard. And it's basically saying, hey, it's nothing that has any flavor, but it keeps us going. So it's a fun little track. Just I kind of wish that the verses had a little bit more of a connection to them.
I know what you're talking about, and I don't completely disagree. However, two things on that. One, I would say as far as disjointed lyrics, we're getting to those, and they're going to be more disjointed down the road than they are on this track. And secondly, the reason I say that is I think the passage in there about the priest, I think it kind of works in a sense that, I mean, obviously it's not as direct as some other lines and other songs, but, talking about how, he goes to this priest, because, the symbol of the priest, nationally known as, a symbol of someone who can guide you to greatness. And so I think what the lyrics are trying to do is sort of create this theme of, oh, there are liars everywhere. So when I go to this priest for, some sort of solace and some sort of truth, he ends up lying to me too in the darkest way possible. And it just proves that there are liars everywhere. And I might be reading a little too much into that myself. But again, compared to some of the other songs on this album, the lyrics aren't quite as disjointed to me as they are coming up.
I'm excited to see what songs you're going to be highlighting here because, it'll be fun. So, you want to go on to the next track?
Yes, track number 2 of 13, Break My Body. And this pretty much is a more of a jam song in a sense. There's really not a whole lot of lyrics to this. The production is very raw once again. Again, Frank Black's and Kim Deal's vocals are way in the back. And the lyrics here are very frank and sexual as far as, this idea of, break my body, that's pretty much the song is break my body. And, but the outro of the song does seem a little bit self-aware in that context that, maybe all this, sexual freedom is maybe not the best idea. Something wrong could be happening here. Again, I thought the song was solid, not necessarily a standout by any means, but a solid follow-up to Bone Machine.
So, yeah, you hit the nail right on the head when you're talking about, like, this is more of a jammy kind of song, because one of the highlights that I had with this song specifically is how the guitar sounded and how it's used throughout the track. Even, like, one tiny moment I'm going to emphasize is, like, when they go out of the chorus into the second verse and how, like, the guitar has a line that's guiding the listener through. And I thought that was a very nice touch instead of just, jumping right back into that next verse. I absolutely love the chorus here, the way that Kim and Frank's vocals come together, is screaming like, break my body, hold my bones. Like, it works out so well. The lyrics, they're interesting. Even like, yeah, it has a lot of, like, some incest kind of themes, at least in the first verse. The second verse, again, we kind of get of a completely other random topic there that I don't even see any connection to whatsoever, so I'm not even going to try to justify the change up there. So, and the only other thing that I'm going to really mention this about this song here is I kind of like how, like, like, with the outro, it just seems like the song suddenly stops at one point instead of, like, fading out or, like, coming to a resolution. And I thought that was a nice touch. But overall, though, like, again, this is not one of my favorite tracks off the album. I do appreciate, like, how it sounds. And I think by this point, was starting to be a little bit more forgiving to the disjointed lyrics, because at the end of the day, this was, like, the Pixies' first album, and I think they were just trying to go for more of a feel as compared to like a complete, like, thematic package here.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think for the most part, we'll get to why it's not the whole part, but for the most part, I think they pretty much nail that vibe that you're speaking of. So that being said, we can move on to something against you, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, dude, I am ready to talk about this track here because this is one of the highlights off the album for me. It doesn't crack into the top 3 in my humble opinion, but it's very close. And the only reason why it didn't crack into the top 3, spoiler alert, a couple of the later tracks off the album cracked right into my top 3 off of, like, that second listen there. But when I talk about, like, the reasons why I like this track here specifically, it's really capturing the feel that the Pixies were going for. So something I spoke about in, like, in our Nirvana review was the concept of like, punk rock and hardcore as a feel, as like, an expression of angst, and this captures that to a T. I love how the vocals are recorded. I found out that the way that they recorded Frank Black's vocals here is that they fed his vocals through a guitar amp and distorted it to all hell, and it comes off so good. And like, even how this song starts out with just like a night, it's like it comes off as like, oh hey, right out of the gate, it almost feels like kind of like a happy kind of song with like how jingly it starts out, but it just keeps building into like this more intense of a song. And yeah, overall though, like, one other aspect I loved about this track here is that the guitars here, like, they almost seem like they grind up against the listener, in terms of just how they're sounding and what they're playing. And it comes off so well, man.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very raw track. Those guitars do drive everything. They are very piercing and right up in the listener's face. The lyrics, again, they're relatively minimal, but they are very loud. And the lyrics also, maintain that pervasive sexual theme that's been sort of, sprinkled throughout the first 3 tracks on this album. This track didn't quite stand out to me, but at the same time, what it did do was continue to establish that vibe that they were going for. Because the vibe I got from the majority of this album is, I used to, not often, but I used to go to a place in Rochester called the Blue Violet Cafe, which was sort of like this, just sort of your usual rock club, black walls, wooden stage, no soundproofing, just a place for total oral debauchery, where it just can get loud as hell, and circle pits were like every song. And that's the vibe I got from, again, the majority of this album. And this, again, I think this track very much continues in that vein, because it feels very much like a lot of this feels like a live album that could have been recorded in somebody's basement, and I say that as a compliment.
Yeah, and that is exactly what Steve Albini was going for. Like, with his mindset with recording bands as a whole, again, he wanted to place the listener in the room with the band. He wanted to highlight what the band brought to the table organically. So that being said, if you brought something, completely great and unique, great, he's going to highlight that. If you kind of suck, not his fault. His job is just to highlight what you bring to the table and make sure, he does his best job possible. So, yeah, I feel like he captures... this is one of the tracks here where you can really feel that you're in the room with the band. It doesn't feel like this is, polished extremely well. But I'm all here for it. Yeah. I have no other notes about this track here.
I don't either. I think it pretty much does what it sets out to do, and it does it very well.
Yeah. So you want to talk about Broken Face?
Broken Face, track number 4. And this one, again, maintains those strong punk club vibes that we've been talking about so far. It's weird how Kim Deal's vocals and also Frank Black's vocals are connected, but they're connected in a way that isn't clear. They work well together, but they're so not doing the same exact thing. Like, they're not trying to harmonize. They're not trying to, sing along together. They just, are doing what they're doing over top this track. And this is where, again, I think Steve Albini's production choices work very well. And it's not really a track as far as the lyrics are concerned, because when I say Broken Face, that's probably like a third of the lyrics already right there. So, yeah, I mean, again, I think this does a great job once again of maintaining that vibe that has been going on throughout the entirety of the album so far.
Yeah. So talking about like vibes here, like one thing that I really did appreciate about this song here is like at least like right out of the gate you get the I got a broken face, and then the track kind of skips. I felt like that was a nice kind of touch. Kind of this like at least with the vocals. I might be doing a little bit of a stretch here. It might be just like, stereotyping like the genre as a whole. But I kind of got the vibes of the Talking Heads from here. Like, just kind of like, sing-songy. Like, I almost feel like this album as a whole was credited as like, for influencing so much of rock music to come. And like even like with the first track, Bone Machine, I wrote down like this is almost like a proto post punk album, and I was just like, wait, that might be way too. I might be I might be just sniffing my own farts with that kind of talk because, as far as I know, punk rock was just starting out at that point. Like, in 19, well, it was hitting its stride around that time. I don't think we really get the first post-punk album until, I don't know at this rate, but, like, I digress. It just, you can see, like, the elements of, like, what, like, with this track here, how it's led to, like, the Talking Heads. And even for maybe to do even like maybe a little bit more broadly, and I might be stretching it here, another band we've covered, Black Country New Road, with like how talky can get, and I like that element of it. The instrumentation here, we've had a lot of dark stuff so far, and a lot of like thrashy stuff, especially what we just talked about with something against you. This feels like the happiest that we've gotten so far with with the tracks here, and lyrics more about a man dealing with mental illness and more themes of incest, especially highlighted in the first verse. And I feel like this track here is like the first time we actually get verses that kind of connect, because the first one's talking about more like has that highlight of incest. I'm not gonna read them word for word, and then you get the other verse where it's saying like, hey, there was this man who smashed his brain into little pieces. So like it could be like you can see the connection there, which is something I like. And it's just the way that the vocals sound, where the line "I got a broken face," like I love that, man. I'm here for it all day long.
Yeah, going back to your comparison about the bands you sort of thought you heard, I don't disagree that Talking Heads was one of them, because that was a vibe I was getting from Frank Black's vocals. Like, he definitely sounds like a wigged out David Byrne on a lot of his tracks here. Black Country New Road might be pushing it a little bit, but and the thing is, when you say proto post punk, I understand why you may be fearing you may be disappearing up your own ass, but at the same time, I completely get what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I do agree with you. The lyrics are definitely the lightest and most least dense we've had so far, and that's a good thing, because again, they were getting a little on the heavy side. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this song. Again, it does it maintains that punk club or rock club vibe of the first three tracks, and again, so far we're 4 for 4.
So that being said, we do, I almost want to say maybe like a hard pivot into Gigantic, which is track 5 off the album. And when I mean like a hard pivot, like, all the other tracks that we've talked about so far, like if you guys could catch a theme, they've been very unique, very like punky. They brought like, crazy stuff to the table. This if you don't even look at the lyrics and realize what they're talking about, this is a standard, like, alt rock track from the late 80s, early 90s, and this was the first single that was released off the album, and this is it was in my top 3 until like a couple of the later tracks off the album popped it out of that listing there. And this track here really just features Kim Deal's vocals for the most part. I mean, you get Frank coming in at the chorus when they're singing gigantic, gigantic. Yeah. And one thing that I liked about the vocals while I'm talking about them is like in the pre-chorus where you get the repetition of "Hey Paul, hey Paul, hey Paul, let's have a ball." I'm completely missing the notes there. I'm no singer. I'm just a listener at the end of the day. But like I like the alliteration of Paul, 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 ball. Like it becomes dizzying to the listener and it works out so well. And just the wailing guitar lines over that pre-chorus, they are so good.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what you said about most of that, because I do like this song a lot too. I agree that Kim Deal, her vocals and the sound of this track very much, it does fit in as an alt rocker in that same time span, but at the same time, because it was the late 80s, this kind of made a preview of, 90s girl rock, whether we're talking about, Liz Phair or Alanis Morissette or Courtney Love. I definitely think this song's a precursor to all that, so it gets marks for that. I do like the lyrics that sort of, again, are a little lighter than the raw sexual energy of Something Against You or, something along the lines of the Bone Machine. But at the same time, I can't help but think that whatever vibes were coming off the first 4 songs sort of gets lost in this, because this feels very polished. And again, it's very good. It's a very good track. It's probably one of my favorites off the album, but it definitely goes away from the sort of live, raw feel that the first 4 tracks had. And it kind of makes me wonder why, either the band or Steve Albini decided to go this route. Again, I'm not complaining. It's a very good track. I love the piano at the end because it reminded me a little bit of Sweetness by Jimmy Eat World. I'm a sucker for the big rollicking chorded piano at the very end of the track. But with this track and the next couple, it feels like we're going more towards, as you said, more of a standard alt-rock feel, which in turn means a bit more of a produced sound like Albini would make for In Utero, in a sense.
Yeah, you really did pose a interesting question, because I think that like that kind of like idea of like why is this track on this album? I mean, it could be on another album or anything like that. I think that might have been why I kind of kicked it out of my top 3, to be honest with you, dude. But I think if I can be maybe try to give some justification why this track landed on the album, is that the lyrics and the theme throughout this whole track here, it's more introducing the concept of a biracial relationship to the masses. And again, this is even something I kind of even pick up nowadays. It's something that a lot of people don't. It almost seems inappropriately taboo in modern society, and I know in the early '90s it was probably definitely taboo. So this might have been just like them exploring punk rock in a different angle, saying, "Hey, screw you. I'm gonna go make love to this gorgeous black man, and you can't stop it because he's gigantic." Which, when I realized what the lyrics were about and how the chorus goes, gigantic, changes everything for me.
I see what you're saying, and you make a very good point. I mean, this whole album is very, again, has a frank sexuality to it, and I do agree that it does fit in thematically. Again, though, it's the sonic shift that is, like you said, worth questioning. But again, I really do like the song for what it is. Again, it's a change up, and as I've talked about many times before, a shift is good for what it is, and the more you can expand your sound without falling flat on your face, the more I'm for it. So, good song.
Yeah, yeah. And just the only other thing that I'm going to mention here, and then we can move on to Rivers Euphrates. River Euphrates. My bad on that is that there is a moment in the second verse of this track where Kim pauses, and it almost just seems like it's in mid thought, and it comes off so well. Like the opening lyrics of the second verse are "lovely legs," they're and then goes right into "what a big black mess, what a hunk of love." I love that, and I love moments of authenticity within songwriting where it's almost like you can really get into the mindset of the singer. It came off really well in my humble opinion. But yeah, that's all the notes that I have off of Gigantic. Again, decent song. Between the two, big singles off the album, this and Where Is My Mind. This is I prefer Where Is My Mind a bit more. But if this came on the radio and if it would come across my Spotify shuffle, I wouldn't mind it. It's not a bad song whatsoever. It's just we both posed an excellent question. Okay, why this song? Why make it this polished as much? And if they wanted to really do it, cool. It just when I when I introduced the song of being a complete whiplash, I was not wrong with that because you settle into a nice punk rock album and it's just oh wait, this is just an alt rock band at their bones. So
So the next track on Surfer Rosa is called River Euphrates. And I'm just going to come out and say it. This is my personal favorite track off the album because the guitars at the beginning of this track are so good. They mesh in a way that's both menacing but tuneful. It's this perfect blend of chaos with synchronicity. And that can be said very well of the vocals too. The way that Frank Black and Kim Deal's vocals, they are so chaotically in sync. When she's going ride, 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 ride. Let's ride a tire down the River Euphrates. This whole thing again just feels. It feels like this is the song that merges both elements together. The frenzied punk nature of the first few songs with the slightly more polished studio alt rock sound of the middle of the album. And I just think it works in pretty much every single conceivable way. And it provides another theme to the album that isn't very, explicit in its sexual nature. It's basically just a song about escape.
So, you covered everything right off the gate of, my thoughts and my feelings off this track here specifically. Again, not in my top three. We're getting to my top three coming up here relatively shortly. But, yeah, you hit the nail right off the head. The main attraction to this song here for me is the repetition of ride, 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 and the guitars that are mimicking them. It almost sounds like they're very menacing, and I'm absolutely all here for it. It's funny that you mentioned the the lyrics not being very explicit and dark in nature. The When I was doing my note taking and I was looking at the lyrics on Genius, there's apparently a theory that I'm not going to give any weight to because I feel I don't know, maybe Pixies fans are a little too. I'm just gonna, for lack of a better word, maybe they're a little bit too horny for their own good. But the way that I'm walking out from this track here, when he's saying "stuck out of gas out of here on the Gaza Strip," that's maybe just saying, "Hey, I'm down on my rope," And when he's talking about "let's ride a tire down the river," okay, hey, my car's broke down, I can't go anywhere. Well, there's a river, I got a tire. Let's take the tire off and just ride down the river. Like, trying to make the best out of any situation. And then again, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, again, fantastic song. Love the guitars, like you said. Love the ride. And one other thing that I'm going to mention before we kick it into the next track here. It might seem like we're not giving too much, like, dissection and too many notes on the tracks here. We're more like, hey, this has an excellent feel. Lyrics are this, and like there's specific moments. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Even though this is 13 tracks, this might be the shortest runtime in an album that we've reviewed so far in our show.
It's up there or down there if you were to say. It is 13 tracks long, but it's only, I think, 33 minutes in length. I mean, a lot of these tracks clock in at around 2 minutes, some of them even shorter than that. So, yeah, you're right. There really isn't a whole lot to dissect. In fact, I'm surprised we got as much as we did out of some of the first opening tracks because they're so short. But yeah, no, you definitely. I'm glad you brought that up because, again, it's 13 tracks over 33 minutes. So, this review is going to be much longer than the album itself. So be forewarned.
I was thinking about that before we even kicked everything off. I'm like, okay, so this album's only 33 minutes, and our reviews typically last probably on average an hour 10 per episode. I'm curious if we're gonna get to that length, and with us vamping on this kind of subject material now, well, I mean, it's only padding the time. So for the lack of trying to get into better content for our listeners, you ready to go on to probably the biggest song off the album and from the Pixies as a whole, Where Is My Mind?
Let's do it.
So, one of the production notes that I other than Something Against You, that I really did appreciate within that song there, is that with Where Is My Mind, you know how it starts out with Kim Deal being trying to start that ooh, and then someone yells at her saying stop. Well, apparently, when they were recording that, Steve Albini did not like how that sounded. He wanted it to sound like you were literally in an ocean. So they had Kim record those vocals in a bathroom.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And which when I found that out, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And even how those vocals are highlighted at the very end where you hear nothing else except for that that beautiful oceany kind of feel. Really, it was a really great production choice by him, and I'm glad that he went with that because people associate this track here with Fight Club and oh, losing your mind and everything. I mean, it's literally called Where's My Mind, but the way that this song came into into existence is that Frank Black was not Frank Black, Black Francis, which is I don't know for mixing up the band members there, which is interesting.
You think hold on, it's Frank Black, Frank Francis. I think it's the same guy.
No, okay. StupidGenius.com. But okay, so the lead singer said that this track here was written during the time he was attending college and was inspired by an experience going scuba diving, and and he had a small fish chase him while he was in the Caribbean. So you really think about the opening verse being with your feet on the air and your head on the ground, and how the oceany kind of sound works. It works out so well, and overall this track here is my favorite off the album for that reason. The guitar work is so good, it's so iconic. And the way that the verses repeat, the first verse repeats with the last verse, I feel like it's a really nice touch. Yeah, I'm absolutely here for this song all day, every day. Put it on the fridge and tell mom about it later.
I'm right there with you. It's not my favorite, as I mentioned. River Euphrates is my favorite, but this I would say is probably a solid number two. Um, and I do like the lyrics, as you mentioned, about how, because like you said, it's based off scuba diving, and does provide a lot of imagery. The way you were talking about Kim Deal's vocals, sounding like they're supposed to come from an ocean, that becomes especially true towards the end of the track, especially with the final few seconds of it. I think that production choice was magnificent. I also think this track thematically links well with River Euphrates because, the first few tracks we're talking about this sort of, down in the dumps energy of, merely existing to, feel sad and have sex. Whereas these last two tracks have been more about escaping from that, whether it's taking a tire down the River Euphrates or in this case, wading in the water, with your feet in the air. And it kind of almost makes you feel like these two tracks thematically are just an escape from that reality of the first few tracks, whether or not it's real or whether or not it's, meaning to tell a story or anything is, something to be considered. But I think the sonic ebb and flow of the track where, the the verses are right out front and the choruses sort of drop back and build up. It's an ebb and flow that works very well, and I completely understand why this is, considered a staple of the pre-grunge scene, because that's exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah. And you made some excellent points of connecting the themes, how they play out through the sequencing of the album. I feel like that's an excellent thing for people to keep in mind while we go over the last couple tracks here, which they're interesting. It's interesting how the rest of the album's playing out, especially with the next song coming up here. One other thing that I'm going to mention about this song here, and then we can move on to Cactus, is that I love how the band plays with dynamics so well within this track here specifically, because you get that iconic guitar line playing over the verses and everything like that, but then whenever you get to the chorus where Frank is singing "Where Is My Mind," it's pretty deadpan, to be honest with you. And it just strips down, the instrumentation strips down. You get rid of that guitar. You just have the bass and the drums, and I feel like it works out so well. And I appreciate where in that instance they could have expanded and really brought the song to a different level, but it shows that they have great songwriting chops where they can show proper restraint with, instead of saying, hey, instead of making this chorus big, we're gonna make it smaller. And I feel like it works out really well.
Agreed. One of the true anti-drops of pre-grunge music.
So the next track is called Cactus, and you want to tell me what a cactus is?
Yeah, in this case, a cactus is a different change of pace. It feels like, because again, we've been talking about, punk club vibes, very punk vibes on the first few tracks, and then the last few tracks, starting with Gigantic, have been more closer to basic alt rock. This feels a little closer to metal, honestly. The beat seems very on the basis of metal. Doesn't seem quite as alt. And honestly, thinking about it now, and I've just thought about this the last couple minutes doing, we're going to talk about this track. I think this is a brilliant move by both the band and Steve Albini to place this track right here, and we'll talk about why in a second. But it creates a good transition between the sort of more polished sound of the last few tracks and the return of the punk club vibes that we're going to get into the final few tracks on the album. I also like the lyrics on here, even if they are a little creepy. I think the way that Kim Deal inflects her voice on the last couple lines of each verse work very well. The only real nitpick I have about this song is that chant in the middle. I have no idea why that's there or what it's about. and maybe you can elaborate on that. But I'm just I that was weird.
Yeah, like I'm gonna be honest with you. That's a nitpick that I share with you because yes, it kind of I don't know. It in my head it's a decent touch, but it re- it is the definition of a nothing burger. It doesn't take away from the track, in my honest opinion, because even like if you're not reading over the lyrics, you really don't know what they're chanting. Which, if those of you who've never heard this track specifically, and you're like, Ryan, what are they chanting? Well, they're chanting the band name. They're spelling it out, which it was weird. And from what I was able to tell based on my brief research, there was no real meaning behind it. They just, tried it out and they're like, yeah, hey, let's just keep it in. But when you talk about the lyrics being creepy, I mean, I'm not going to read too much into it, but one of the things I loved about this track here, you were elaborating on it very well, is that yes, it gets us back into like we had Gigantic and then we had Where Is My Mind, not like back to back, but for lack of a better like talking point here, we get the two biggest singles out of the way, the most refined and polished sounds. And if I'm not mistaken here, this helps us get back into the last little leg of the album, with the last couple tracks being like more leaning on that experimental side and how those tracks work out so well. But this track here, it really grows on like, so if you're listening to this, do yourself a favor, go check out the lyrics so you can understand what we're talking about. But the subject material of this song is in jail, and he's just asking for a dress to be sent to him. And like, not gonna elaborate on the lyrics too much with that, but you can tell with each verse, like the paranoia and the mental deterioration is growing with each verse, and how the track highlights that with like just how bare and like kind of creepy the instrumentation can be. It works out so well. And like, this track never really pops into a loud moment, but it really knows what it is and what it does, and it does it so well. It's just a very interesting track, man.
It is, and the way you sort of went in depth about the lyrics and how it does build with that creepy vibe kind of makes the chant seem a little worse, honestly. Because, again, it really doesn't serve any purpose. But I'm in wholehearted agreement. I think this is a great transition piece. It definitely teeters from the polished nature of the escape of the last couple songs back into this dark reality that was spoken about on the first few tracks. So again, it's not one of my favorite tracks from just a general I like listening to this standpoint, but it's brilliantly placed, it's brilliantly timed, and I appreciate the way that they've managed to again transition from one back to the other.
So, before we go on to Tony's theme here, like, it's thanks to tracks like Cactus and, like, a couple other tracks that we're going to be talking about here coming up here soon, and along with, like the earlier tracks, that I'm glad that we did this review, because, like, I only knew Pixies from, like, their hit singles, or, like, stuff that I heard off of Doolittle. Like, if they could write stuff like this, like, I've never heard anything like this before. And I mean, it might be Steve Albini's production is certainly helping, but like the songwriting chops here, like, they're really, really good. That being said, moving on to Tony's theme, and out of all the tracks here in the album Surfer Rosa, this is the one that I've had the most trouble with, in terms of like what to make out of it. Because, like, on my first listen, I'm like, oh, this is kind of like a nothing song. It's a fun song. It has a nice little beat to it. and then when I did my, detailed listening where I actually took notes, I'm like, oh, this song kind of sucks. Like, one of the favorite things I noted about it on the initial, detailed listening was I like the chorus where like, you almost hear, like, Frank barking out, toe, neck, toe, neck. I feel like that works out really well. But when I did my re-listen of the album today to prepare for the podcast, and I don't know if this is just my mindset with waking up this morning and just having a cup of coffee, watching Mortal Kombat characters fight against each other, but ultimately I'm landing on the fence that I don't mind this track. It really doesn't have to do anything kind of crazy. Like the nitpick that I had initially here is that the vocals were recorded to a sense that you can't really understand anything that's really being said. But after seeing the lyrics and listening to it this morning, I'm landing on the fence that this song it's a good song. Really landing on that punk rock vibey kind of feel. But the initial nitpicks that I had, I basically erased this morning.
Yeah, I tend to think that, again, I don't think this is a great track myself, but at the same time, I think it, much like Cactus, is more there to reestablish a vibe than anything else. Like, if Cactus was the lyrical re-implementation of the darkness, then this is the sonic re-implementation of the punk vibes. Because the only two notes I have for this song are thus. Number one, it is a resurfacing of basement club vibes. And two, it sounds like the B-52s on heroin.
Oh, man.
That's pretty much all I have to say. I mean, it's a very punky track. The intro is very sort of in your face, and I don't like the fact that it resurfaces halfway through the track. I've got to be honest with you. That is probably my one nitpick about the song, because it's very wacky deli-like and not necessarily in a good sense. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate this track for what it is, but it's not one of my favorites. But again, this is what they wanted to go for, and I respect that.
The more and more I think about this track here specifically, I don't know if you ever listened to the band The Dead Kennedys, but this track here reminds me so much of what they brought to the table. And I could be getting the dates wrong, but the Dead Kennedys were a hardcore punk band from the late 80s, a band I need to re-explore. They were fundamental in my high school years and my, high school to college years. Like, they were so good. But, like the nonsensical verses about, that are here, and, like, you get, that fun chorus, and, like, all, like, zany kind of instrumentation, and especially with that intro that you talked about that reappears in the second half of the track here, where it's just like, this is a song about a superhero named Tony. It's called Tony's Theme. Like, I can almost picture Jello Biafra, introducing a Dead Kennedy song like that. But yeah, ultimately, I think I've talked myself into it enough. I like this song.
It's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
All right. So, what's the next track after Tony's Theme here?
The next track is called Oh My Golly, and this track is all over the place. Because it starts with, like, some tribal drums at the beginning, which I kind of dug. But then it just sort of stops and goes right back to the punk vibes of the last track, and again, the first part of the album. And then, for the first time, and for not the last time on this album, Frank Black starts singing in Spanish. And overall, I think the track is fine. But realistically, the track, for what it is, it's, again, just the weird tribal drums at the beginning, about maybe a minute and a half of an actual punk song, and then an outro, which is just spoken word, just banter in the studio from Frank Black, which, again, this is very much a hodgepodge type of track. I didn't hate it, didn't necessarily love it either. I think it just, again, it feels weird because we've been talking about how a lot of this feels like it was recorded in a basement or recorded at like a rock club, but there's no denying that that outro was a studio thing. Like it's a studio thing, and it kind of does resurface that dilemma we were having before with how much of this is meant to be sounding like it's in the studio and how much of this is sounding meant to sound like it's live and raw.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at one of my top 3 tracks off the album. With Oh My Golly. So, like, a lot of the elements that you talked about, like, in terms of listening, this is my second favorite track off the album, so the third favorite track is coming up here relatively shortly. But I'll start with the candid moment that was caught at the end, and how, like, you know, it's interesting, like, how Steve Albini had the mindset of, like, oh, he wants to place you right in front of the band with his recordings. Then he catches moments like this, which is completely candid, and it works out well. And I might be talking myself into this as well, where, like, he wants to place you in front of the band. What better way to do that than catch, like, candid moments, which this is if I'm not mistaken, this is the first of 2 candid moments that are caught on the album, and it works out well, especially considering that, like, in the candidness, Frank Black's saying, like just repeating, like, you know, you bleep and die, and throughout the track here, let me just check something here. Yeah, so, like, backing up here a little bit. So talk about the Hispanic lyrics. I looked at the translations. So, like, the first verse is basically talking about, like, you know, going to the beach and, like, you know, meeting up with this surfer chick named Rosa and, like, you know, making love to her. And then, like, in the second verse, we get to, like, a point where, like, he's losing hope and he's just like, oh, he's just losing life and life is just total garbage. So, like, the how it ends where Frank is just being candid, being like, you effing died, like, you know, it kind of brings things to an ultimate low. Again, I know it's a candid moment, but I kind of did appreciate that. I love the Hispanic lyrics. I feel like it's a nice touch, and especially how it's responded with, oh my golly, oh my golly. I love that. The chorus here is so good. I love how jammy and how much you can really sink your teeth into it, where it's just like, Rosa, oh, Rosa. Like, it works out so well. Overall, like, this track is definitely a highlight off the album. Kind of one other thing I'm going to highlight here is that an interesting thing that I don't know if I missed in the first verse is that with the guitars, again, we're getting that how the guitars are just blaring underneath everything, how they're almost like right up against the listener, and that's, again, another theme throughout the album, how the guitars are just almost like grinding to a point in terms of, like, how they sound and how they're played and just how the production works. And it just, I love this track, man.
I can respect that. Again, there are a lot of elements that work, and I don't really hate any of them. I just kind of wish it was a little bit more cohesive, although I do give you credit for pointing out the sort of lyrical cohesion between the song and the sort of off-kilter studio banter that, you know, in most ways wouldn't link together, but in a sense kind of does. So I appreciate that too. I don't hate this track, but it's not one of my favorites.
Yeah. So, you ready to talk about Vamos?
Let's talk about Vamos. And I would say out of all of the sort of punky tracks off this album, this is probably my favorite. It's not my top 3, but it's definitely, again, one of my favorite of the punky tracks because the guitars in all ways on this track work. The acoustic guitars at the beginning sort of have this frenzied shuffle behind them, and then the electric guitars are agitating in the right way, just in your face, screaming, unrelenting, and it just works. All the while, the drums are basically just holding everything together like the strongest glue you can imagine. And once again, we have a fascinating use of Spanish in the lyrics. Again, I just think this is a really, really, really solid track that just, again, sort of reestablishes not only the hard rock vision of this entire album, but really just is a strong, sort of a overall picture, like a real good, strong introduction to Steve Albini's vision for this album.
So you talk about the drums off this track here. One of the things that I really didn't note off this whole track, and especially during the craziest guitar solo that I've heard in a while, where if I can remember correctly, based off of my research, the player of the guitar who was doing that solo, the guitar player, I don't know why I disconnected the words like that, but he really didn't want to do a traditional, like, oh, hey, I'm gonna just, shred on this guitar, and like they use different kind of production techniques to splice parts in together, and it works out so well. And all the while you're hearing all that experimentation, you get that very focused, very like concrete drum beat with the bass accompanying everything that keeps everything dialed in to a bloody T, and it works out so well. And like, even outside of that guitar solo, which was definitely a highlight for me, just the way that the song begins with, oh, hey, here's some acoustic guitar strumming that's accompanied with more Spanish lyrics, where like the leads, like it translates into like just talking about like moving out of the person's house and moving into his sister's house, who lives in New Jersey. But then you get that change up with that squealing guitar. It works out so well. And ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at my third favorite track off the whole album, Vamos. Like, the thing that sold this track here for me is that guitar solo, man. It is so delicious and it is so good.
I'm right there with you again. I would say I don't. It's tough. I don't know if I would put this ahead of Gigantic or behind it in my top three. It's definitely in my top four with the middle part of this album. Because, again, like, pretty much agree with everything you said. The guitar solo is great. The drums are so in lock with the bass. And it just feels like a really good, well-produced track for what it is.
So, you ready to talk about I'm Amazed?
Let's talk about I'm Amazed.
So, we get into the second candid moment of the album here, right out of the gate. And I feel like, I don't know, I might be trying to connect things that just don't connect, but like the opening candid moments, basically it's Kim talking about like, this high school teacher who was accused of inappropriate relations with his students. And then I love how Steve cut off the conversation after the lines, and then the next thing you know, and then it kicks into the track. I feel like that works out so well. And then throughout the whole track here, you get, if we're really trying to paint this as like, hey, the subject matter and the person who's like, the focus of this song is that high school teacher, just somebody who's lost touch with reality, and doesn't really care. Like, the first verse is talking about the day before that I was wed, she went upstairs and she shot her head, and like the way that it's sung, and with the chorus being I'm amazed, it almost seems like, oh yeah, hey, my fiance just killed herself, whatever, I don't care. Like, it works out well. Again, I might be trying to stretch things a little bit too much, in my opinion, man.
I agree with that. I think you are stretching things out a little too much. Because I will say the studio banter at the beginning of the track is rather candid and interesting. but I'm sorry. We were talking earlier about how the lyrics on Bone Machine seem to be a little bit disjointed. I think these are the most disjointed lyrics on the entire album. I think the lyrics are nothing burgers. I think Frank's vocals are a little too out there on this track. And just to be completely honest, this is my least favorite track on the entire album. It's not a whole lot to me, man. I'm sorry.
I can respect that. I mean, again, this is me. Like the way that I'm approaching this track here is like I'm trying to connect stuff, but even like not even trying to connect the lyrics and like the structure as a whole. One thing, a couple other notes I'm going to make about this, and then we can finish her out with Brick and Red, is that an interesting choice here is wherever you get in the verses where Kim and Frank are singing together, that you have one vocal line doing one kind of rhythm, and then you have the other vocal line doing something completely different, but they're both arriving at the same points. It can bleed on the edge of like not being pleasant to the listener, especially if you're not accustomed to like very dissonant sounding music. But let's face it, if you've made it to track 12 on Surfer Rosa, and you've gone to this track here, like you basically know what you signed yourself up for, and you were already familiar with dissonant sounding music. And I did appreciate in the third verse how like Frank is just singing over like rapid tom movement with drums instead of like the like what we've experienced so far within the album, well, within the track itself. Again, I can totally respect how the lyrics are basically a nothing burger and how this can be the worst track off the album. So I totally respect your opinion, dude.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about it is I think you talk about connectivity. I don't think the lyrics of the actual song connect with the banter at all. And that's a shame too, because I feel like the subject matter of Kim Deal's anecdote about that teacher would make for an interesting a song and a subject matter, but I just don't hear it on the remainder of the track.
All right, cool. So you ready to close this out with Brick and Red?
Yes, Brick is Red is the final track of 13 on this album, and it's more or less, it almost feels like an anti-encore to the album, because I love the riffing. It feels like just a little jam track, essentially, for the first half. The guitars sound very well. Again, the drums and the bass are right in line. And then when the other two start singing, Frank and Kim, it doesn't really matter at that point. I mean, they're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall at this point, but I don't mind it as much as I did on I'm Amazed, because again, I feel like the riff and the production is just so well that they can be singing about anything, and I'm just like, yeah, all right, cool. So I think this is a nice way to end the album as it is. I mean, it's not a, it's really kind of a nothing burger, but it's a pleasant nothing burger, if you will.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. Like, I'm not gonna be able to elaborate too much into what you brought to the table, because like a lot of what you just said, I agree with. But like in terms of like what this song is really about, it's about fishing. Basically from like the mindset of a fish getting caught. But like one thing that I want to bring to the table that that you kind of alluded to in like a couple of the earlier tracks is this theme of escapism, and like here with lyrics about, hey, it's not time for me to go, and how at the end where Frank and Kim are singing about, my eyes have just turned the color of diamond, just the pretty color of ice. Like whenever you catch a fish, like whenever they die, like that's what their eyes turn into. And this might be just talking about like the final escape that people have in life, where like the final escape is death. But this is all draped over a song about fishing and a jammy kind of song to wrap up a rather interesting, intense album that has just been a fun time for me to talk about with you here today.
Yeah. So, we did it.
We did it, man. We discovered who is this person named Surfer and why is she Rosa-ing.
Do you want me to edit that out? I feel like we need to edit that one out.
No, we're keeping that in. All right. So,
Oh, jeez.
So, do you want to give your rating first, or do you want me to shoot my rating out there?
I'll go first. And this was a very fascinating album to listen to. An album that, for all intents and purposes, I think is greater than the sum of its parts. Again, the majority of the album definitely brings back those, vibes of going to rock clubs and, just hearing the band live and in your face and just sort of being nonsensical in ways that are, for the most part, delightful. And even though the move towards a more polished sound towards the middle of the album is a little confusing, the tracks that it produces are probably my favorites on the album. That being said, there were a few moments on the album where I was kind of like, meh, and ultimately, the kind of rock that is being presented on this stuff, while again, it's nice to listen to, isn't something I'm always going to go for. But I definitely respect and, in a lot of cases, admire what Steve Albini did. And I appreciate what the band brought to the table as well, as far as their sonic fury and their sort of, again, frank, sort of in-joke type of lyricism. All in all, I think it's a really good album. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10.
Okay, nice. My initial thoughts about the album is like right out of the gate, like how I mentioned, whenever I did the initial listen, I was just like, I kind of don't like this album outside of like the more polished songs, Gigantic and Where Is My Mind. And I was just like, is this gonna be one of the first reviews that I suggest that I just initially just tank the score because of how just raw this album sounded? But then, whenever I did do the detailed listening with me looking at the lyrics and really just focusing in on what the band was bringing to the table, I really dug what this album was going for, man. And like the production choices that Steve Albini executed here, they work out well. I'm a huge fan of the background vocals in Where Is My Mind. Instant highlight off the whole album for me. I love just the different kind of sounds that this album goes for. A couple of the nitpicks that I did have was the lyrics just being a little disjointed, where it's just completely something I can't even within all my brain power that I'm able to muster connect them to. And if you want to hear me trying to muster some brain power to this, some of the tracks here, go listen to a couple of last bits of the reviews that we did, where I'm talking about like the lyrics in I'm Amazed and a couple of the previous tracks. But that being said, this band does do experimenting really well on this album here. Sometimes it kind of can bleed over the edge where it can be a little bit too much. But for the most part, I absolutely loved my experience checking out Surfer Rosa. And I'm going to give this a solid 9 out of 10, in my humble opinion. I love the punk rock feels. Like, the production choices are really good. It's just missing that one little thing to kind of like kick it over the edge. Maybe a more refined focus on the verses and a couple of the earlier tracks could have done it. Who knows? But yeah, I feel good about 9 out of 10.
All right, so between the two of us, I believe that averages to an 8.25 out of 10 between the two of us, because math.
Cause math!
So my next album recommendation based off of Surfer Rosa. Again, I've been talking a lot about rock club vibes and sort of a raw sound. And I'm going to go with a band I've actually seen live that has a very similar sound and a very similar makeup. Because much like the Pixies, this band also has a male vocalist, a female vocalist, and again, a very raw sound that occasionally jumps into polish. I forget what year it was. I want to say it's from 2016, but I know the album is called 409, and the artist of the album is called Purple.
Oh, okay. I don't think I've ever heard of that artist, but I might check it out later on here. Always interested to check out something new. So, especially considering that how you dropped Jellyfish on me with the last review, and I really dug what was going on there. But that being said, my next album recommendation for me is going to be more based off of what bands have been influenced by the Pixies. And one band that came to mind right away is Weezer. And the album that I'm going to recommend based on, like, explicit themes and, like, really creative structures of songs and just, like, overall a really unique experience that fans love is the album Pinkerton. Easy choice for me. And it's interesting to see, like, how much, this group as a whole has influenced so much of, like, rock acts that have come after this album. So, yeah. I feel like that wraps up Surfer Rosa pretty well. I mean, for a 33-minute album, we've gone on for probably over an hour and 20 minutes now.
Yeah.
That being said, Matthew, it is your turn to pick. I feel like our palettes are no longer clean. We don't need to. Surfer Rosa was an interesting experience. So, what do you have cooked up for us next week?
I kind of struggled this week because I wasn't sure where we could go from here. And then I just decided, you know what, I'm not going to overthink it. I'm not going to try to go for some sort of theme or be like, hey, let's talk about this because reasons. I'm just going to give you 2 years of the past, and both these albums that I have in my mind have 10 tracks. They're both in the 1970s. So I'm going to give you the option of either 1973 or 1975.
In honor of Matt Healy and how we inadvertently talked about him in the Tortured Poets department, I'm going to go with the 1975.
Okay, that's a terrible reason, but I'll take that. and also, I don't hate it because I think we may be talking about the better album of the two. We are going to be talking about the 1975 release by one Mr. Bob Dylan called Blood on the Tracks.
Oh, hell yeah, man. I like one of my favorite Bob Dylan albums, and I'm happy that I'm going to be able to have an excuse to dissect it very thoroughly. So I'm really excited for that.
I am too, man. I am too. This is going to be a good one.
So if you, the listener, don't know what a Bob Dylan is, okay.
How?
But if you have not listened to the album that we're going to cover next week, which is Blood on the Tracks, do yourself a favor, check it out, listen to it at least once before the next review drops. That way you're familiar with what me and Matt are going to be talking about. And if you are familiar with Blood on the Tracks, check it out, just so you can get yourself reacquainted with it. If you're a Bob Dylan aficionado and you know every single lyric on Blood on the Tracks, well, you don't need to listen. Just, listen in next week. So that being said, if you've reached this part of the episode and you liked what you heard, and let's face it, like, if you've gotten to this part of the review and you're still listening to me talk right now, you're liking what me and Matt bring to the table. And the best way that you can help support me and Matt bring more stuff to the table in terms of musical discussion with various albums is on that podcasting platform that you are listening to me talk on right now. Give us a follow on that platform. Follow, subscribe, whatever the terminology is. Leave us a positive rating. And if you're listening to this on the platform that is called YouTube, make sure that you like the video that this is playing on, and then you subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below with an emoji of what you felt about the review, the album as a whole. If you want to follow us on other platforms, we have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Threads. Matt, what is the tagline for those social medias?
The tagline is TT Hey Listen.
And if you want to write to us directly, we have an email. Matt, what is that email?
It is ttheylisten@gmail.com.
But with that being said, for the last time in this episode about Surfer Rosa, I am Ryan James Kearns.
And I am Matthew James Durzik.
And unfortunately, it's time for us to go. Because we need to find our minds that are way out in the water.
Well, if we're going out in the water, let's take that tire and ride down the River Euphrates.